Great, let's get started because I know that you have a lot to talk about. So this is Rabbi Ari Bernstein. He does a lot of different education roles in the social justice world in Chicago and beyond. Works with JCUA, works with Avodah, advised me for my master's thesis. And I've been fortunate to know Aryeh and his wife for a long time, and I'm glad that he's coming back to teach for us again. So the floor is first.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back, even though not in person. Hopefully one of these days I'll be back. Had the pleasure of teaching I think 3-part series for Har Zion, I think in 2017 or 18 or so, on immigrants and refugees and biblical and rabbinic thought. And it was a lot of fun, and it's great to be back talking about things that really matter. I would love to hear just like a little bit of who's in the room. I know everybody's here for the Torah, for the learning, so we won't spend a lot of time on intros, and you may all know each other, but I don't know you. And this isn't a lecture, but a collaborative learning process. So I'd love to hear if each of you could just say your name and also maybe something that's brought you to this session, whether it's about the topic of housing and homelessness, whether it's about your love of studying Torah, no matter what it is, whether it's because you owe money to David Schwartz and this is a way to pay him off, who knows, like whatever it is. Hinda, since you're unmuted right now, why don't you go first and then you can call on somebody else to introduce themselves next.
Okay, thank you. My name is Hinda Blum. I'm a fairly new member of Har Zion. I am very interested in social justice, environmental justice, and studying Torah. So it all comes together with homelessness, which is a horrible thing.
Yeah.
And something that I can barely fathom it happening to me. But it could, it happens to anybody, it could happen to. That's the scary part. So I'm quite interested in listening to you tonight.
I'm interested in listening to you too, Hinda. Great, who do you want to pass it to?
Phyllis Rubin.
That's me, Phyllis Rubin. What brings me here is I really, it's distressing to think that people are homeless in this country. The more I think about it, I think we really have the power of curing all these sad things that are occurring here, and homelessness is one of them. But we don't cure that. We don't end it. And so I'm interested in what you have to say.
Who do you want to pass it to?
Sorry. Sure, Suzanne.
I'm Suzanne Fournier. I've been a member of the congregation since '99. I love all things adult education, especially Torah learning. And I just thought this series is particularly timely with all the protections, eviction protections running out in so many places in the country, and that we're looking at really, just a wave of homelessness coming into our society. So very timely.
Yeah.
Jill.
Hi, everyone. I'm a member at Har Zion. Aryeh, you may recognize my claim to fame as mother of Rebecca Dempsey and mother-in-law of Akiva Madison.
Oh, wow.
See your name and face.
Yay, yeah. Last time we saw each other, we were both all gussied up for Rebecca's wedding.
Yep. And now, unfortunately, I have like my work laptop open and kind of half occupied this evening, but I really wanted to hear this as best I could. There's so many ills in the world, but homelessness is something that we see often. And I always feel very hopeless as far as what to do about it. Like, it's just, to me, it's a very visible sort of conundrum day in and day out. So I'm interested in the topic. Thank you for doing this. And let me see who else I can see on here. Norma.
Thank you. I'm Norma Berlin. I've been a member of, and my husband Howard, of West Suburban for 55 years. And I'm a past president of the synagogue. And anything David Schwartz recommends, Howard and I do, because we love David. If he says you're going to give us a great evening, I'm for it. And also, I'm interested in hearing something about Jewish homelessness. I hear about everybody else being homeless, but not very much about Jewish homelessness. So thank you.
Great, thanks. David, or Howard, do you want to introduce yourself as well? Say anything?
Howard?
No.
No, he'll go with me.
Okay.
I don't know if there's anybody else on who.
Great.
Oh, Kay Greenfield. Yes, Kay.
Yeah. Why don't we let David introduce yourself first, so as Kay gets settled, and then you'll pass to Kay. So now Kay will know what we're doing, and then we'll start.
Okay, super.
Yes.
Sure. So I'm David Schwartz. I've been at Har Zion, I guess this is my 4th year now. And I'm here because I love learning, and I become a better teacher by learning more. And I know that I have a lot to learn from Aryeh. So this seems like a great opportunity to both learn and learn from you.
Great, thanks. Kay, everybody just introduce themselves and just said a word about what's bringing them to this session. If you want to unmute yourself and just introduce yourself and share what's bringing you here tonight.
I'm Kay Greenfield, member of West Suburban Temple for a long time, lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico for a while, but came back here, and I'm interested in the subject that you're talking about. So I'm glad to be here tonight.
Fantastic. As David said, I'm Aryeh Bernstein, and I've been teaching Torah professionally for a long time, over 20 years, and I tend mostly to be drawn to topics that would, I guess, loosely be considered social justice, mainly because I think that those are the main themes that I see jumping out in Torah, and because I think Torah is a political and often confrontational body of literature for a world. The Torah really comes into being in a world of oppression, and we're still in that world. So this is our topic for this evening, certainly in Chicago on a night that's 26 degrees, and it's very cold. And remembering, as we, thank God, are all in places of warmth and safety, let's dedicate our learning tonight to all the people in Chicago, perhaps in Oak Park, in the surrounding areas, certainly very close to Oak Park, on the west side of Chicago, who don't have a safe or warm place to be right now. So let's jump right into it. I will do some screen sharing, but also in case you want to access the document in a different way, I just shared the link to it in the chat. If you like to be on 2 different devices or enlarge it or manipulate it however you want, you can do that. And I'll do some screen sharing too. We'll look at some documents together. We're going to look at some halachic legal documents to share like what Torah literature thinks, what the Bible as well as the Talmud and halacha think about housing rights, housing responsibilities of a society to house people, etc. But I want us to begin with a prologue, an agadic, a non-legal, a narrative prologue that I think should give us a sense of what's at stake in this topic. Maybe in some poetic or mythic language. We're going to do our work in English. The Hebrew or Aramaic of all texts is right here for everything. And occasionally I will point out something linguistic of interest for anybody who has the linguistic capacity. And if you do, you're encouraged to follow along on your own. We'll do our work in the English. Let's look at a midrash. This is a collection called Vayikra Rabba, which is a 3rd century, well, the work is edited probably 5th century, but the sage quoted here is actually 2nd century in the land of Israel. And we hear a fascinating story about the 2nd century sage and his travels and encounter with homelessness. Would somebody like to volunteer to unmute and slowly, intentionally read this text for us? Meaning we'll all be reading it, but somebody can do it out loud. Kay, I see you unmuted. Would you like to read this text?
Sure.
Great.
Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah went to Rome, and there he saw pillars of marble covered with thick blankets so that they would not crack in the heat nor freeze in the cold. When he went outside, he ran into a poor person with a thin reed mat beneath him and a thin reed mat on top of him. About the pillars, he read the verse, "Your beneficence is like the high mountains," saying, when you give with abundance. About the poor person, he read the verse, "Your judgments are the great deep," saying, when you beat down, you are exacting.
Okay, thank you, Kay. Another second for people to kind of reread to themselves, make sure there are things that you missed. Okay, let's unpack this together a little bit. What is happening in the story? We're going to get to his exegesis and his emotional use of these verse in Psalms in a moment. So let's bracket that if that was confusing. Let's start with the scene. What does Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah see, and how do you react to reading what he saw? Anybody can unmute yourself and contribute here. Is it something familiar? Is it something foreign? What would your reaction to be seeing what he sees? And what's your reaction to his experience?
Pieces of marble have covers on, and this poor guy is in the cold with nothing but a thin reed mat. So we're blanketing the pillars of marble so they won't crack, but the people are freezing. The poor person is freezing.
Has any of you ever seen anything equivalent to that? Any seen anything like that?
Well, to me, it just rings true of everything. I mean, it's so easy to walk around even just Oak Park and see, just signs of wealth and comfort, and attention given to things that are not people, and then people out in the cold.
Thanks. That's a really important thing just to name. It might seem obvious, but I think this text is challenging us to make it shocking, to make sure we're always shocked by that sight. It may not be on State Street or LaSalle Street. It may not be thick blankets covering the marble, because we have more expensive and more effective methods of climate control now. But if you're in downtown Chicago and you go to the Lyric Opera or Civic Opera, or if you go to the Citadel building or any of the big investment banks or the Board of Trade or any of these spectacular buildings, they are perfectly climate controlled in ways to protect the buildings. Some of them have security guards and alarm systems. If they're security guards, they're in heated areas to protect the glass and the marble and the buildings, not even just from destruction, but even sometimes just from like vandalism or from people taking refuge. And next to all of them, even on a cold night like tonight, you will see poor people begging for money, people coming out of stores on Michigan Avenue, North Michigan Avenue, where they've spent hundreds and thousands of dollars, and walking past somebody right by the bridge over the river asking for change, and the vast majority of people not giving. Where does this site take place for Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah? This is literally important here, where this midrash cites that. We experience it in our own backyard, in Rome. That's really important, because remember, in the 2nd century, what does Rome signify in a text of this era? it's not just that he went, I mean, I think there are two levels of it. One, he goes, it's only when going to a foreign place. This is what we expect in other places. We don't see this in our own place. We see this elsewhere. To put it in crude language, that crude and ungenerous language that might fit this context of military occupation, it's what the Goyim do. I think there's a sort of like literary hint to the text that like he goes to Rome and you'll never believe the barbarity that he saw in Rome. Rome, for us today, Rome is, it could be Frankfurt, it could be Sao Paulo, it's a big metropolis of a wealthy foreign country. For him, Rome is the capital of the occupier, the country that laid waste not that long ago to the temple and exiled and tortured many Jews, etc. And Jerusalem and the south of Eretz Israel under Roman occupation are in brutal poverty. But he goes to Rome and there's also poverty there with this contrast. So I think it's, first of all, relevant for us to notice Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania is experiencing shock and horror. It's something that you and I see every time we go downtown Chicago, and not only those times, and every city in America and in the West. And also that literally it's being associated with the other, with the bad guys, with the oppressors. And that's, I think, an important thing to notice. One thing that I struggle with is when I'm walking in downtown Chicago, or for that matter, in my own neighborhood in Hyde Park, walking up and down 53rd Street or 57th Street, and there are people asking for change outside restaurants where people are having expensive meals. How do I not get used to it? How do I get used to it enough that I'm prepared to have money to help people when I go out, but not emotionally used to it? That, to me, is, I think, a function of this midrash. Moving on a little bit, I want to just pay attention to this verse from Psalms. It's one verse that is divided into two halves. So the verse is addressing God poetically. Your beneficence is like the high mountains, your judgments are the great deep. Tower of Babel. In its own context, in the poem, in the book of Psalms, these are actually two parallel phrases. It's very common in biblical poetry to say, to use two different idioms that express a similar thing. So basically we're saying God is so great in these two different areas, both in tzidkatra, and in its own context, tzidkatra probably means your righteousness or your treatment of the innocent. But in this context, it's sort of like, when you do right by someone. So I render it as beneficence. It's like the high mountains. And mishpatecha, your judgments, your laws, are like the great deep. In its context, those are synonyms. Just to say it's vast. God is river deep, ocean wide, mountain high, like the Tina Turner song, the Icon Tina Turner song. God's greatness is river deep, mountain high. They're both ways of saying the same thing. In this context, Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania is turning the verse on itself in a way that actually, I think, invites some daring theology here. Saying like, well, when I look at these buildings being taken care of so generously, it's like, God, wow, you've really looked out for this marble pillar, haven't you? But here, your judgments are the great deep. This person who's suffering and who's been abandoned so greatly, like that is, boy, if this is a punishment, you really have no mercy. Now, I think for us, I think sometimes any notion of reward and punishment being applied to suffering in the world, especially post-Holocaust, can seem totally anathema. I think it's possible that Rabbi Yeshua in this context is operating with that context, that anybody who suffers is being punished. It's possible. I think it's also possible that he's cheekily challenging that notion, but operating in a literary world where people assume that notion. And he's saying, what I'm seeing in front of me is an absolutely grotesque inequality and injustice, and turning it and invoking biblical language. To put it in today's context, it would be like, like if you want to express that something is really bad, you might not just say, this really stinks. You might quote Shakespeare if you really want to give it heft to what you're saying, and say, you know, what's the quote from Hamlet? Something is afoot in Denmark. Some I forget what the quote is, but in other words, like when people use ancient literature to, they're drawing on a mythic register. So I think Rabbi Yeshua, in order to react to how shocking and how grotesque this contrast is, he's speaking in a biblical register, in a way that actually, in a certain sense, challenges God about the injustice in the world. I just want us to start with that before we now turn more granular to some legal texts, to remember what's at stake. Sometimes when we read legal texts speak with a tone of control. And it's sometimes easy to forget who exists on the boundaries of that control, of the legal discourse, and what the stakes are if we don't apply the law properly. Before we move on, do we have any other questions or observations, reactions, comments to our framing midrash? You can just unmute yourself and go ahead and speak if you do.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, one, what should we learn from this text? There's obviously a difference between the rich and the poor. And the other thing is, what can we learn about his place of residence? He obviously came from a more affluent area also, because he's so shocked and appalled by what he sees, the difference.
That's a really interesting comment. So you're learning from this that he must come from a relatively affluent area. And I think that's an interesting observation. If his shock is at the fact of somebody being poor, then I think that would be a worthy conclusion. But I want to
the other way, I suppose, also.
I want to push you on that a little bit. Like maybe what's bothering, like poverty, he might know very well. Jerusalem, certainly under Roman occupation after the destruction, had dire poverty. The north was less extreme. The north had a little more prosperity, and I don't remember where Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania lived, but Jerusalem certainly had dire poverty. I suspect he was familiar with poverty, but this contrast, that resources could be hoarded in such a contrasting way. Notice that the verse that, you know, his reaction isn't just, God, how could you let somebody suffer? There are plenty of biblical verses that could be invoked. God, oh, you know, my God, how could you forsake this poor person? That, you know, various verses like that, of that kind of register. Here it's the contrast, that there could be poverty when there doesn't have to be. That there could be poverty when everybody knows that there is wealth to be distributed. There are resources to warm, even as much as just take the blankets. Even if you're not going to give this person a home, give this person the thick blankets that are wrapped around the marble. Let the marble crack a little bit and let this person make it through the night. So I don't know exactly what Rabbi Yeshua's economic background was, but I think the contrast, the allowing of poverty, there's a sense in which homelessness in the United States is even more galling than homelessness in a country in the global south. In a sense, not, because all the countries in the global south have just been stolen from by Europe and the United States. I mean, that's the legacy of colonialism. Like, I was going to use an example of like Haiti as like, you know, homelessness in the United States is in a certain sense more grotesque and appalling because you see homeless people right beside all this hoarded wealth. Like, for example, if you go shopping at Water Tower in that area, or go to LaSalle Street. But of course, if you dig a little bit deeper, any, you know, Haiti or any country in the global south is a country that's been extorted and exploited and stolen from by Europe and the United States. So anywhere you look, you're looking at that willful poverty and homelessness. It's a good framing, it's a good centering for us to remember. I think this is similar to what Kay said, I think Kay said at the beginning, maybe somebody else, that homelessness is rampant in Chicago and in the United States and doesn't have to be. There's enough resources in every city here for people to be housed.
Yeah,
So,
and even more obvious in places like San Francisco and Seattle.
Right. Very good. Very good. Which are just more extreme versions of Chicago in terms of wealth disparity. Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
This story also reminds me of a poem by Yehuda Amichai, I think, about a guy. The poet is saying that there's a tour guide who's giving a tour and saying, do you see that man over there with the baskets? Well, right to his left is a Roman arch or something like that. And Yehuda Amichai says things will be better when the tour guides say, you see that Roman arch over there, that's not so important. But if you look at that person, he's carrying food home for his family.
Great. And you want to just spell out a little bit I think I see where you're going, but spell out the connection.
Yeah, the idea of like what gets the priority. Is it the things or is it the people? Yeah. There's another midrash as well that this reminds me of about the Tower of Babel, and the rabbis ask what was so bad about what they were doing in the story that required God to destroy it, because the text doesn't make that super obvious. And one answer they come up with is that the tower was so tall that when a brick would make it all the way up to the top, if it fell down and smashed, people would be really sad because they had to start all over again. But if a person fell off, we've got more people.
Yeah.
That misplaced priorities caused God to destroy it.
It's a great thematic connection you're drawing. And I think in a sense, like this midrash spells out in a more sorted way, like what's at stake in that Amichai poem. Like, why is it really important to notice the simple actions and drama and life of human beings living their life more than we value walls and buildings and things? This midrash really gets to what's at stake, because if you value artifacts more than people in terms of what excites you, you're going to get to be a kind of society that puts more resources into keeping the Art Institute perfectly climate controlled while people might die in their sleep on the street outside. So having this background and setting the stakes of what's at stake for us emotionally, that homelessness should be shocking and appalling and make us draw on biblical theological registers and react with theological outrage and bewilderment at it in a rich society. Let's move into the legal material. Let's scroll down. So, sort of the basic question: is housing a civil right, human right? Rights language is a little bit elusive. It's very common in the American discourse, which is very individual focused. Biblical language tends to be more obligation focused, but I think there are still ways in which we can, using our American idiom, get a sense of if housing is a civil right. And what does that mean legally? In America, it's not. It's not treated as a civil right. Certainly Dr. King and like the Poor People's Movement said it should be, and many others, but legally it's not. Let's look at the Torah. So we're going to look at the 15th chapter of the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, verses 7 and 8. Would somebody like to read these two verses? This is in the context of the sabbatical law, which is actually very relevant. We're in a sabbatical year right now. So in a context of discussing economic inequality and so on, we get these two verses.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Should there be a pauper among you from one of your brothers within one of your gates in the land that Yahweh your God is about to give to you, do not harden your heart nor clench your hand against your brother, the pauper. Rather open your hand to him and lend to him enough for his lack, whatever is lacking for him.
Okay, thank you. So this is, the whole book of Devarim, the Israelites on the cusp of becoming owning class people. They were slaves, and then they were wanderers, dependent wanderers, and now they're about to be owning class people. One powerful thread of the book of Devarim is God's tremendous anxiety that the people are going to become wealth hoarders and cruel and start exploiting each other. And that comes up in a lot of different passages throughout the book. This is one example of it. So the rest of the chapter says, these are ways to try to make sure that there won't be a pauper among you. But these verses deal with what happens if there is. If there's a pauper, one of these gates in the land that Adonai, your God, is about to give you. And the Torah always says that. Don't you forget it. And this land is not yours. You don't have it because you deserve it. Jewish people have no right to the land of Israel. God has chosen to give them a shot. In the 7th chapter, 8th chapter, God is explicit. I have beef with these 7 nations that has nothing to do with you. I'm getting rid of them anyway. That's none of your business. And so the land's going to be empty, and that's not good. And I liked your ancestors, so I'm giving you a shot, even though you're worthless people who have been whiners and moaners and not deserving. So I'm giving you a chance, but this is not because you have any merit. The exact opposite of a kind of prosperity gospel, which is the most extreme kind of version of American individualistic liberal ideology. Be that as it may. So don't harden your heart. If anyone is poor, you, the individual, have to freely lend. Halachic literature understands any context of loans to poor people as being about tzedakah. So actually the laws about lending appear in 2 different places in the legal codes, both in the laws of tzedakah and the laws of finances and loans. And we have this fascinating phrase, enough for this person's lack, whatever is lacking for him. Now, there are 2 things that are interesting about that. One is the apparent redundancy. Enough for his lack, whatever is lacking for him. De machsaro asher yachsar lo. The Torah is famously terse in general in saying what it needs to say, or at least the rabbinic perception is that the Torah is terse. And anytime there's redundancy, the rabbis are going to want to know what's really implied by all that. The second thing that's interesting is that this phrase shifts the focus from you, the owning class person, not being stingy, shifts the focus onto the person who is in need. Focus on whatever this person needs. Now, before we move on to see how the rabbis define what are needs. So let's imagine now that we're not just a bunch of individuals, but we've evolved to the point that we can actually have a city council or a tribal council, a regional governmental structure. And we want to respond to the values of this passage that we're supposed to reduce poverty and make sure that people have what is lacking for them. Let's have a brainstorm together, and I'm glad to see a lot of people are already unmuted. What would be your instinct? What are some things that should be included in whatever is lacking for someone? If you are on the city council and you know that there's, a number of poor people, how do you determine what the needs are of poor people? It's an open question. Let's hear some responses.
One thing that I would,
Yeah.
one thing that I would put forward is dignity, because what is lacking for him, the individual, might not be the same as what might trigger my own feeling of lack of dignity. And so so not to come up with just this lowest common denominator of aid, but to really take a look at restoring the dignity of the individual, however that might be.
How might that be? Let's brainstorm a little bit. If, let's say, from a city council perspective, you have a budget, so how would you set up anti-poverty programs that center the dignity of the recipients?
My daughter is a social worker, and currently her job is to work with homeless people, which is a difficult thing. And homelessness is just it's a large category. It's a basket that a lot of things go into. Mental health is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Substance abuse is part of it. Sometimes trauma is part of it. So as I interpret this, it's like whatever is lacking, maybe, we can't put everybody into the same bucket. Whatever is lacking for each person may be a different thing, or a different thing to remedy, or a different thing to fix.
So how do we think, UK? How do we manage that from a governmental perspective? Let's say I come forward and I say, I've always dreamed of driving a Lamborghini, and I'm really lacking that because I want it. I feel inadequate not having a Lamborghini, and it's really lacking for me. And I heard from the Har Zion caucus that my dignity should be centered, and I get to determine what it is that I really need. So you're on the city council. How do you respond to that?
Maybe you have to have an open dialogue with people to find out what it is that they actually are lacking. I'm even more struck though with the word lend rather than give, because lend seems more humanitarian and kind, rather than if I give you something, here, you poor person, you just take this.
Yeah.
But if I'm lending it to you, you have the opportunity to either return it or to do something in return for someone else.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Another topic we could go down, or a different rabbit hole that starts with this text also, about why it is that halachic texts understand all these texts about lending to be tzedakah, but also why it is that the Torah will generally speak in terms of loans. And I think part of that is about centering dignity, but with an expectation that anytime you lend to somebody poor, you can't think of it as a business investment. That's why there's a prohibition on charging interest to poor people, because a lot of the financial industry is about the great profitability of debt, of poor people's debt. And the Torah strictly prohibits that. Whereas if you're lending to a middle-class person, that's really an investment that's like win-win. And if you're lending to a poor person, it has to be in the sense of tzedakah, with the assumption that they might not pay back. But it preserves their dignity for it to be a loan, maybe. So let's move forward and actually see what the Talmud, how the Talmud learns this significance. So this is from the Talmud Babel Ketubot 67b. It's actually an earlier text called the Tosefta, which is parallel to the Mishnah. So published around the year 200 in the land of Israel. This is how it's edited and located in the Babylonian Talmud. Would somebody like to read this text? It's starting in our sages taught on the end of the first page and then going on. Maybe Hinda or Phyllis, we haven't heard your voices.
Yeah, okay, I would.
Thank you.
An orphan who comes forward to be married, a house is rented for him, and the bed and all his furniture are arranged for him. And after that, we marry him to a wife, as it is said. Enough for his lack, whatever is lacking for him, Devarim 15:8. Enough for his lack. This is a house, whatever is lacking. This is a bed and table for him. This is a wife. Can you scroll down? This is a wife, and so does it say, I'll make for him a sustainer alongside him.
Okay, now, right, thank you. So now there's not, surprise, surprise, a third century text is androcentric, is male-centered, and not egalitarian. Unfortunately, we're used to that, and we have to do some cultural translating. So I wanted, for our purposes, notice that what the rabbis are unpacking that redundant verse, they're learning something broader, that in terms of basic needs that might be considered rights, in the sense that the court, the city, the community is obligated to provide them for somebody housing, furnishing, and intimate partnership relationships. I want to just tease that out, what might be implied by that. The beginning of lacking is housing. And that is something we hear all the time from housing organizers, anti-eviction organizers, anti-poverty organizers in general. They say by far the most important and the cheapest way for a community to fight poverty is to house people. If you just give people homes, that has a domino effect on all sorts of other issues that end up costing the entire community a lot of money too, but more importantly, on the humanitarian level, on the human rights level. If people are housed, they're way less likely to miss doctor's appointments, they're way less likely to have mental health or physical health crises, and they're more likely to have, to be able to build community when they have stability. Stable housing comes first. Our Torah the rabbis understand our Torah to be saying that. They locate this question in the question of an orphan, because an orphan is the most obvious structural case of somebody whom the community has to take care of in a tribal context. In a tribal context, in theory, land is distributed equally among the tribes. Every 7 years, debts are forgiven, and every 50 years, land is reapportioned back to the original equitable land distribution. And so somebody should be able to inherit and should be able to be taken care of through familial and tribal channels. But an orphan does not. An orphan is somebody who falls through the cracks. Other texts, you will see the ger, somebody who is an undocumented immigrant. An immigrant who's not a citizen, therefore doesn't have tribal inheritance, is somebody who's very vulnerable. Widows can also be vulnerable in this way, but an orphan is the most obvious case of somebody who doesn't have obvious people who can take care of them. So the community has to take care of them. And the basic things that we have to take care of, the way we understand the lack that you have to provide, is housing, furnishing, basic furnishings for the housing, and intimate relationships, partners, spouse. So today that might not take the form of actually making a shidduch and arranging a marriage for somebody. That takes away agency. But being sensitive to relationships. Actually, one of the most controversial things in Chicago in the history of housing, in the heyday of public housing construction, mid-20th century, they were building these massive high-rises that had a lot of problems to them, actually, and were mismanaged and under-resourced and so on, and actually became public health crises for the residents in a lot of ways. However, when the Mayor Daley, Mitch Richard M. Daley administration knock down the massive, famous Chicago housing projects, most famously Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes and others as well. They did it with using humanitarian language that these buildings have become controlled by drug trafficking and sex trafficking and asbestos and disease, and it's not humanitarian for people to live there. However, it's also true that those housing projects were on very valuable land adjacent to rich neighborhoods, and the city was chomping at the bit for them. And a lot of the people who were rehoused were not rehoused successfully and not rehoused with people they've been sharing community with. And something that we're learning from this, this notion of a spouse here is remembering that when you're housing people, it's not just saying, well, we have a list of houses here, we're going to plug you here, we're going to plug you there. Who are your relationships? We have to make sure that people are in stable, loving relationships. Community is a very important, integral part of reducing and preventing poverty. We remember that the context for this passage in the Torah was, if there is an evyon, a pauper, in a chapter that led off by saying there should be no pauper among you. So I think the rabbis here are thinking about poverty prevention, starting with housing, stable housing, furnished stable housing, and community. With our remaining few minutes, I want to just run through a few other things that'll fill this out a little bit. Once we talk about rights this way, how do you actually make that happen? So I want to quickly note that there are welfare structures in Torah law. So basic quick background. We're not going to look inside at sources about this. Hopefully some of this will be familiar, but just for background here, the Torah, which assumes an agricultural economy, prescribes 4 different types of welfare programs to close poverty gaps in the agricultural economy. So one is called leket, and that's sheaves dropped in the field during harvest. So Hinda, you're a farmer and you are bringing in your sheaves. If you drop one, you're not allowed to go back to it. If you weren't careful enough to hold on to it, it's not really yours. Once it drops, it's not yours anymore. It's there for poor people to come and collect. Shichacha is you did bundle it up and you left it in the field and then you went inside and you forgot it there. You're not allowed to go back for it. You have to leave it there for the poor. Peah, the corner of the field, which from the get-go, you don't harvest it in the first place. You just, there's a corner of your field that you leave unharvested, which means that poor people can come and farm it and work on their own. And finally, maaser ani, a tithe for the poor, is an extra tithe separated for poor people in the 3rd and 6th years of the 7-year cycle, sort of recognizing people might slip and fall behind a little bit, and every few years you need a little extra tax bonus. So those are the Torah's settings. By the way, I want to note that what that means also is that as a farmer, it means you're also not allowed to put a fence around your property, because that would render leket, shichacha, and peah completely useless. And the food would just rot. If the Torah assumes that there's access to poor people, landless people, to come collect and also work land on your property, you can't kick them out for trespassing. So that's background. In this following text, the rabbis set basically the equivalent of a poverty line. So in other words, who's poor enough to qualify to take these forms of public aid? The Torah speaks to owning class people. The Torah speaks to the farmers saying, you have to leave these things there for the poor. The Mishnah, this rabbinic text, is already thinking about who qualifies as poor? Is schnorring allowed? Let's say I actually do own land. I don't feel like harvesting, or maybe I'm not a particularly apt farmer. I didn't work very hard, but the Berlin family farm is just mwah. So I want to walk over there, and I know that there's some really, really high quality wheat that is bundled that was left there that they forgot. I want to take it. Am I allowed to go take it? How poor do you have to be allowed to collect leket shichacha peah? So the Mishnah says, would somebody like to read this Mishnah, chapter 8, Mishnah 8 of Tractate Peah, about the laws of leaving a corner unharvested?
I'll try it.
You got this. I believe in you.
One who has lost 200, is that Zuzim?
Yeah, one who has 200, not has lost. One who has 200.
200, see, I can't read it. One
Yeah.
who has 200 Zuzim may not take leket, shechicha,
Yeah, very good. You got it.
peha, or maaser ani.
You did it. Go on.
If they have 1 dinar, less than 200, even if 1,000 people simultaneously give to them, they may take. If their assets are mortgaged to a creditor or to his wife's marriage insurance contract, he may take. He is not obligated to sell his house or practical goods.
Great job, Phyllis, reading. Thank you. So let's unpack what this means. First of all, there's a language confusing thing. Zuz and dinar are simultaneous. Basically, Zuz is like a Latin word. It's Zeus. It's because Zeus's face was on the coin. And dinar is more the Aramaic Semitic term. They're synonymous. Why the same Mishnah uses both, I don't know. It's an interesting linguistic textual question, but for our purposes, those are synonymous. So in case that was confusing. So how poor do you have to be? You have to have less than 200 zuz of liquid capital. So if you are cash strapped right now, today, you've got only like, let's say 50 zuz on you, and you come forward to take, you go to the fabulous Berlin estate to go take some of their leket and shichacha left out there and left out in the fields. If the Berlins might come and say, wait a minute, Kay, you're saying you're cash strapped, you own a house. No, the Beit Din, the Mishnah makes very clear, you do not have to sell your house or practical goods. If you are cash strapped, that's what these welfare programs are there for. If you have assets, but you can't access them because they're mortgaged to a creditor, so you have debts out there, or if you're a man and you have, you're married and you have a ketubah, with a marriage insurance contract that you would be liable for, if you're a man and your wife dies tomorrow, you have to be able to if you die tomorrow, your estate has to be able to hand over those 200 zuz. We can't count that as something that you have usable. We don't want you using that money for your daily sustenance. In other words, the Mishnah, welfare is to enable people to have liquid prosperity, day-to-day prosperity, even when money is tight or stuck. And we don't obligate somebody to sell their house. Keeping people housed comes first. In terms of how much 200 zuz is, it's really hard to estimate it because inflation and within generations of the Mishnah and generations of the 2 Talmuds in different countries with different economic systems and all sorts of things that you would expect happen in an economy over time, it's really complicated. The best estimate we have is from this medieval halachic text, the Or Zarua, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe, who says that the basic sage estimation is that 200 zuz is the cost of a year's expenses for food and clothing for a couple, for a married couple. So in other words, you are eligible to take public aid if you have less than a year's worth of liquid financial security above and beyond being housed. That's very far from the poverty line in the state of Illinois or any other state in the United States. And it says something profound about how important halacha considers it to keep people housed. We keep people housed, then we can start to fill in any gaps once people are unhoused, it becomes a lot harder to make sure that they're getting access to what they need. But for a while, maybe you had a bad crop, or maybe just some debts piled up, or a loan went bad, your things are tight, you can go harvest somebody else's corner for a little while you stay housed, keep things afloat. You're less likely to sink into grotesque poverty. I'm going to stop there for tonight. Next week, we're going to continue with more halachic elements of how this actually plays out, who's responsible, and we'll start getting into tenant obligations and landlord obligations, what actually makes a good community and how we both prevent homelessness and treat it when it's coming up. And now I'll turn it over to Hinda for some announcements.
Okay, I have one major announcement. A week from this Sunday, March 6th, from 11 o'clock to 12:30, you're invited to attend an event sponsored by the Social Action Committee on Tikkun Olam, Repair of the World. And in this case, we're talking about protecting and sustaining our environment. So we will offer solutions to how to do that, providing concrete actions people can take to make sure that the environment is livable for ourselves now and for future generations. So that's it. And you're all invited to come. We have speakers among our congregants, your friends. It's going to be a casual conversation, not a lecture, and friendly. So you might just pick up some tips on what you can do.
Is it virtual, Hinda?
Is it what? Yes, it's going to be on Zoom.
Okay.
So what you can do to just help the environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Hinda. David, do you have any closing announcements, or in our remaining 2 minutes, do we want to see if there are reactions, comments, questions?
Just to say that thank you very much. We'll be on the same link, the same time a week from now, and a week after that. And if there are questions, but it looks like we've got a minute or two for that. So
yeah. So any questions or reactions or thoughts from the text that we saw about housing as a right? Jill, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about the strong sense of community that was apparent, right? This was a group of people that were all like studying Torah. There was a sense of community that, to me, that feels like such a important quality that it sort of doesn't seem, it's not pervasive when we're talking about homelessness in sort of greater, even Chicagoland. I mean, I don't think people think of, like, I think if a synagogue member ran on hard times, that folks might donate for that person. But I don't see it out in sort of greater society. And I think that makes a huge difference, the sort of community and the trust that people have to be able to make those systems work.
Thanks, Jill.
It's just interesting to think about how to apply, how to then apply these into a broader world.
Thanks, Jill. Anybody have a final thought or reaction or question to chew on before next week?
Very interesting to listen to, to read that and hear you talk about it.
Thanks, Phyllis. Thanks, Phyllis. So I'll leave you, the question to ponder for next week is, if Torah and the rabbis are telling us essentially that housing is a right and that local systems of government should be prioritizing keeping people housed as the grounding of other forms of poverty reduction and social services, what are the mechanisms to do it? And to think about in Oak Park and Chicago, in Illinois, in the United States, and the places we live, how should we be doing better? What could halacha, what could Torah actually be informing us? So we'll start to look at some more of these nitty-gritties, both from the perspective of of landlord and tenant obligations and government in rabbinic sources next week. I look forward to learning with you all. And if you have other friends, if you enjoyed the learning, want to invite other people, you can let them know that we will refer to things that we learned tonight, but the learning will sit on its own. It won't be necessary to have been here to have a good experience next week. Have a great week.
Thank you so much.
Tower of Babel.
Shabbat shalom. Bye-bye.